It's July 28th, 1915, Chicago, Illinois. The city is in a state of shock and mourning. Funerals are taking place all over the city, so many, in fact, that funeral directors and gravediggers cannot keep up with the demand. Hearses are in such short supply that Marshall Field and Company provided 39 trucks to serve as makeshift hearses. The Bohemian National Cemetery alone has dug 150 new graves. Almost 700 sons, fathers, mothers, and daughters will be buried by the end of the day. Innocent victims of an entirely preventable disaster. The SS Eastland, today, on Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs. Welcome, everyone, to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, tales of mishaps, misfortune, and misadventure. Today, we'll be talking about the SS Eastland, a tragic story which occurred on the Chicago River right in downtown Chicago. I had the pleasure of speaking to Paul Durica, who is the exhibitions director at the Chicago History Museum, and we'll be hearing from him throughout the episode. Before we get started, I'd just like to ask everybody to please hit subscribe or follow on your podcast app and leave the show a 5-star rating and review. It really will help others to find the show, just like you did. Thanks so much. In the early 20th century, the Western Electric Company in Chicago had become the manufacturing arm of the expanding American Bell Telephone Company, the company that would later become American Telegraph and Telephone, or AT&T as we know it today. Due to rapid growth and increased demand for telephones, the manufacturing plant would need to be expanded and more workers would need to be hired. In 1904, construction began on a new state-of-the-art facility in nearby Cicero, and the 600,000 square foot plant opened in 1905. Named the Hawthorne Works after the neighborhood in which it was located, it was seen as a model of modern manufacturing and efficiency. The Hawthorne Works employed about 25,000 people by 1915. The employees of the works typically lived within walking distance or a short train ride from the plant. The Hawthorne Works was the lifeblood of the neighborhood. Here's Paul Durica to explain a little bit more about Chicago's history.
At the time of the Eastland disaster, the Western Electric Company was one of the largest employers in the Chicagoland area. It was located in the town of Cicero, which is just west of the city of Chicago, borders the city. And it was not just the home to Western Electric, but to a lot of other industries as well. A lot of train lines had stops over in Cicero, and so there were various train yards, there were other kinds of industries. And what does that mean? Well, it means it's a great place for immigrant labor to come because there's lots of unskilled work that needs to be done there. It's a kind of entry point for many people in the United States. And this was certainly the case with Western Electric. At the time of the Eastland disaster, over 20,000 people were employed by that company. A large number of them were recent immigrants to the United States. And a lot of these immigrants were coming from Central and Eastern Europe. So places like what would eventually become today's Czech Republic or today's Slovakia, even though at that point, both of those areas were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Poland as well. So it was a large community of immigrants, working class people, and there were more people at that time working at the Western Electric Company, the Hawthorne Works, than there were actually residents of Cicero. So it does give you a sense of how big a company this was. In fact, there were more people employed there than lived in the town that was home to it. And that also suggested that there were people kind of coming from the surrounding area who worked there, from Chicago, but from some of the other nearby suburbs, places like Berwyn and Oak Park.
Western Electric had planned its 5th annual company picnic in Michigan City, Indiana, 38 miles across Lake Michigan. The employees worked long and hard hours, 6 days a week, so this annual event allowed them to dress up, relax, and be treated to luxuries that they otherwise wouldn't be able to experience.
Many of the people working at Western Electric, because they were immigrants, because they were working at relatively low wage positions, that didn't leave a lot of resources left for recreation. So the annual picnic that the Hawthorne Planning Committee put together, I mean, this was a large social event. Now, even where the Western Electric is located, it's not that far geographically from Lake Michigan. But given the limited resources of a lot of the immigrant workers at the company, for them, it'd be one of the rare occasions to actually get out to the lakefront. And not only to get out to the lakefront, but to actually cross the lake and go to Michigan City and have this day full of playing baseball, playing tug of war, having a picnic, listening to music, all of these wonderful recreational activities. But there's another kind of side to this story, which is in some ways, particularly after the Eastland disaster, you begin to sort of hear stories about how some of this recreation was perhaps a little coerced. So you get different employees from Western Electric, one, kind of reminding people that even though the company was kind of organizing this effort, it wasn't free. You still had to purchase a ticket on the excursion ship. And this would actually end up proving critical in some of the investigations that occurred after the tragedy. But also, different employees reported being more or less coerced by their foreman, kind of encouraged very heavily to purchase these tickets and to go on this trip. So in some ways, it was a great opportunity for people to relax, to enjoy a kind of excursion on Lake Michigan, to bring their families along for this kind of day-long experience. But there were these suggestions that not everyone was going along entirely willing.
7,000 tickets were sold, the most ever sold for this annual event up to this time. Tickets were sold to employees for 75 cents each. Children were given half price fares, and infants received free passage. Western had planned to treat its hardworking employees to a scenic ride across Lake Michigan to Washington Park in 5 state of the art excursion ships, including the SS Eastland. The passengers with tickets began to descend upon the downtown docks on the Chicago River, and the 5 steamers were moored and waiting.
July 24th, 1915, was a Saturday. And even though it was a Saturday and it was early in the morning, crowds began to gather around 6 a.m. in the morning because the Eastland was scheduled to leave the dock at 7:30, to be followed by several other excursion steamers that were headed to the same destination. Even though it was a Saturday, it was in the city of Chicago, which meant there were a lot of things going on surrounding it. So where the Eastland was located, it's right on the eastern spur of the Chicago River, which feeds directly into Lake Michigan. And on either side of the river, you've got businesses, you've got warehouses, you've got factories, and you've got bridges that cross the river. So you have a lot of traffic kind of going over the river. You've got even the elevated train system going over parts of the river. So there was a lot of activity even early on at 6 in the morning. And by the time the Eastland is getting ready to kind of depart, and there's going to be a tugboat that's going to kind of take it out from where it's docked and kind of help shepherd it into the lake. By that time, if you believe some of the accounts, it's estimated that there are about 5,000 people kind of gathered there, waiting not just to get on the Eastland, but some of the other ships as well that were kind of part of this group that were going to travel to Michigan City. If you look at sort of ticket sales as well, that about 7,000 of the over 20,000 employees at Western Electric were planning to go on this excursion. So we're talking about just thousands of people kind of gathered right there at the side of the river. And there was no real reason to think that anything out of the ordinary would happen. Everyone was in a kind of festive spirit. They had this nice lake trip ahead of them. They had a full day of picnicking. There was music playing on the different ships as people were boarding. In fact, there was a band right there on the decks of the Eastland. Thousands of people in a very festive mood, wearing their best kind of attire to recreate in, and just kind of looking forward to this trip. And I don't think anyone had any reason to foresee that it wouldn't be anything other than a lovely day.
The SS Eastland was commissioned in 1902 by the Michigan Steamship Company and built in 1903 by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company. It was originally intended to transport fruit from Chicago to South Haven, Michigan. This was the first and only passenger steamer ever built by Jenks. The company traditionally built freight vessels with the cargo and most of the ballast seated low in the hull. The Eastland seemed to carry a bad omen with it from the start. Soon after its maiden voyage, on July 27, 1903, the ship struck the tugboat George W. Gardner at the Lake Street Bridge on the Chicago River, sinking the tug, although no major damage was done to the Eastland. Just 2 weeks later, on a voyage to Southaven, 6 of the crew members refused to stoke the fire for the boiler, claiming they had not been given their ration of potatoes. The captain had the men arrested at gunpoint, and they were charged with mutiny upon their arrival in Southaven. The captain, however, was dismissed from his duties. The ship did not originally meet the speed requirement of 22 miles per hour, and its draft was too deep for the shallow Black River in Southaven. Modifications were made to the ship that increased its speed, but it also increased its weight and decreased its draft. In other words, the ship was heavier and sat higher up in the water. This made the ship prone to listing.
The Eastland had a rather troubled history. The boat takes its first voyage in 1903, not long after it was constructed. Originally, it's traveling from Southaven, Michigan to Chicago and then back and forth. And within the second year of its operation, July of 1904, it has one of its first serious mishaps. And in many ways, this mishap mirrors what would occur 11 years later. Then that the boat is perhaps a little over capacity. A lot of the passengers are kind of, in this case, gathering towards the starboard side, and the ship starts to list a little bit while out on the open lake. This causes some panic among the passengers. A lot of them, particularly the women, begin putting on life preservers. But the crew of the ship is able to kind of reestablish calm, and the Eastland rights itself. And so it seems like the ballast is functioning the way it should be, and the boat is able to kind of complete its voyage, albeit at a slower pace, and is slightly delayed. Not long after that, there are some other mishaps. At one point in its early history, there was an explosion on board that occurred within one of the smokestacks. Also, on the route between Southaven to Chicago, the company tried to basically downplay the accident, but it eventually did get reported in the newspapers. What you see, when you go back and look in the historical record, and particularly newspaper accounts of the Eastland story, is this word cranky being used over and over again. And essentially, the Eastland became known wherever it was, based. It was kind of known as this cranky ship, basically meaning that consistent and constant kind of problems with it, and it was sort of need of repair. So it was temperamental, right, as a craft, and it's sort of hard to manage.
In 1904, the Michigan Steamship Company advertised that the Eastland was the speed queen of the lakes. The city of Southaven disputed that claim, arguing that its ship, the Sioux City, was the faster ship. It was certainly faster than the Eastland throughout the 1903 season, and they challenged the Eastland to a race. But Southaven was unaware of the modifications made on the Eastland. The race date was set, and it generated quite a buzz in the community, with people making wagers on which ship would be the fastest. Each ship was timed as it steamed from Southaven to Chicago. The Eastland won this contest by a landslide, clocking in at 22 miles per hour. Between 1904 and 1906, more modifications were made to the Eastland, including repairing damage to the hull caused by scraping across the sandbar near Southaven twice a day. 49 cabins were also removed. These costly repairs and changes put the Michigan Steam Company in massive debt, and the company was soon sold outright to its own president, Robert Blacker, in 1905 for $100,000. He renamed the company the Michigan Transportation Company. During another incident in 1906, with 2,530 passengers on board, the Eastland faced near catastrophe. Again, caused by a mass of passengers moving to the top deck, the ship became unstable. Like before, proper adjustments were made to the ballast and the ship was able to right herself. It was said of the Eastland that she, quote, behaved like a bicycle, being unstable when loading or unloading but stable when underway, wrote transportation historian and economist George W. Hilton, whose 1995 book, Eastland, Legacy of the Titanic, provides a meticulous investigation. Safety inspectors focused only on the Eastland's performance while underway, and failed to pay attention to any safety issues while the ship was being loaded or unloaded. The Eastland routinely was certified as safe. Some began to call the ship the, quote, crank of the lakes, taking a jab at its previous nickname. In 1909, the Eastland no longer made overnight trips, so the remaining 39 cabins were removed. This created an in between deck for the passengers. By 1910, the Eastland had again been sold and now sailed between Cleveland and Cedar Point, Ohio, and had enjoyed several successful years carrying its passengers as they reveled and danced on its decks. However, rumors and jokes about its instability still dogged the Eastland and its owners. The new owners, the Eastland Navigation Company, issued a $5,000 challenge in the Cleveland Plain Dealer on August 9, 1910, reading, "In the hope of influencing this class of people, there have been put into circulation stories to the effect that the steamer Eastland is not safe. Bring forth a naval engineer, a marine architect, a shipbuilder, or any one qualified to pass on the merits of a ship who will say that the steamer Eastland is not a seaworthy ship, or that she would not ride out any storm or weather any condition that can arise on either lake or ocean." This challenge was never met, and no payouts were ever made. In 1912, several changes were again made to the Eastland. Her smokestack was cut down to make them shorter to help the ship's stability, but this did not produce the desired outcome. That same year, the Eastland again listed severely at 25 degrees while passengers were loading the ship in Cleveland. It was soon corrected, but it was yet another scare, and many passengers chose not to return to Cleveland from Cedar Point on the Eastland. The Eastland dropped its capacity again to 2,000 and operated at a loss in 1912 and 1913. The ship then returned to service in Lake Michigan for the 1914 season. Safety inspector Robert Reed had inspected the Eastland and approved it to carry 2,045 passengers. She would also get a new skipper, Captain Harry Peterson. Peterson had 14 years of experience with his master's license and came highly recommended. Although his experience and record were impressive, all of his experience was with yachts or freighters, and not pleasure cruise ships like the Eastland. The Eastland would operate in 1914, rarely carrying more than 1,000 passengers, with one exception: the 1914 Western Electric Company picnic. The Eastland picked up its passengers and carried them to Michigan City, Indiana for the picnic, and returned them safely to Chicago. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912 in the icy waters of the North Atlantic plays a part in this story. While a tragedy, it did trigger a call for better safety precautions and regulations. In particular, lifeboats for all was the primary focus. Legislation was proposed requiring all ships to carry enough lifeboats for all its passengers. The call for lifeboats for all was understandable, given the lack of available lifeboats for those on the Titanic that could have been saved. But a man by the name of A. Shantz, the general manager of the Detroit and Cleveland Navigation Company, argued against this legislation for ships operating on the shallow Great Lakes. At a Senate hearing in 1914, he argued that the additional weight of added lifeboats to the smaller ships of the Great Lakes would make them increasingly top-heavy and more prone to capsizing. After years of debate, the La Follette Seamen's Act of 1915 was passed, which included lifeboats for all. During the debate over the legislation, the Eastland was sold to the newly formed St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company. Ironically, it was Shantz who recommended that the new company purchase the Eastland. The year 1915 would bring further changes to the vessel. A new chief engineer was hired, Joseph Erickson, an experienced engineer, but yet again his experience was not with leisure ships such as the Eastland. His experience was with freighters and heavy car ferries that had lowly seated and stable loads. The ship itself now had years of use carrying thousands of passengers, which had taken its toll on the ship, especially the heavily trafficked and weather-worn decks. The main deck and the in-between deck were resurfaced with many tons of concrete. This modification was especially significant as it made the ship even more top-heavy. To make matters worse, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company decided to add 6 life rafts and 3 lifeboats to the Eastland, even further adding to her weight.
Earlier that month, early in July of 1915, Reed, who's the sort of federal inspector, decides to increase the capacity of the Eastland. So it was set at around 2,000, 2,200 people, and he increases it to around 2,500. And later, as the tragedy is being investigated, this decision to increase the capacity is called into question. And there are kind of allegations made that maybe he was being influenced by various shipbuilders associations and so forth. The justification that Reed gives is that if you look at the longer history of the Eastland, there had been points in its past where it had carried as many as 3,000 passengers. So he believed that the ship was equipped and could safely handle an increased capacity. And given that the company that had purchased the boat not that long before the tragedy planned to have these kind of regular trips between St. Joseph, Michigan and Chicago, it made sense to kind of increase the capacity because they could expect that kind of volume of passengers on a regular basis. And also, Reed sincerely believed that all of the various safety protocols were being followed, that there were enough lifeboats for the passengers, that the ship's ballast system was in good working order. So there was nothing to suggest to him, if you trust his testimony, that the tragedy would occur.
If the Lifeboats for All Act had already been in place, the Eastland would only have been approved for 1,200 passengers. Heavier decks, additional lifeboats, and now additional people would add approximately 33 tons of weight to an already dodgy ship. The company also never once properly tested the Eastland with all these modifications. On the morning of July 24, 1915, with waving, excited passengers waiting to board the Eastland, Captain Harry Peterson ordered the ballast tanks to be pumped out and emptied to raise the ship up and make it easier for passengers to board. This was customary for Captain Peterson. However, William J. Wood, a naval architect, advised that the ballast tank should remain filled at all times throughout the voyage. At 6:40 a.m., the gangplanks were lowered and a mad dash for the ship ensued. The rush of people boarding was so massive that it would have been impossible to stop them from boarding. A ragtime band played as passengers danced and rejoiced. Just 1 minute later, at 6:41 a.m., the ship began to list toward the wharf on its starboard side. People boarding the ship tended to linger on the starboard side, waving to people on the wharf and not disperse throughout the ship. For this reason, Chief Engineer Erickson filled the port side ballast to accommodate. By 6:51 a.m., she had stabilized herself and all was thought to be fine. Just minutes later, at 6:53, Erickson noticed the inclinometer, a sort of plumb bob indicating the ship was listing badly to the port side, toward the river. Erickson responded by partially filling the starboard side ballast in hopes of righting the ship. She stabilized briefly, but 50 passengers per minute were being added, and many of them were now congregating on the port side to get a view of the river.
Captain Peterson and the chief engineer, Erickson, began to kind of adjust the ballast, which was sort of the standard thing to do when the ship begins to list. They started very quickly to kind of run into some issues. It was later kind of believed that the ship was having some trouble with the intake, so it wasn't able to actually kind of get enough water in at a sufficient rate to kind of right the ship. But there was also a significant delay as well. So when Peterson realized that the ballast that being added wasn't actually kind of correcting the list, but instead everything was worsening, there's about a 15 to 17 minute delay before he begins to kind of consider alerting passengers to it. And once again, you have to keep in mind just how regular these trips were and how things like this, like a ship listing a little bit, just sort of happens. And then usually it self-corrects, and usually everything within the ship functions correctly.
When the gangplanks were closed, it further moved people toward the starboard side. The lower decks had become extremely congested, and many passengers began to move up to the top deck. One passenger, James McCollum, told the ticket taker he thought the ship was already overcrowded. Harbor Master Adam Weckler said he never saw the Eastland carry so many people, but by 7:10 a.m., all passengers were boarded. The ship listed a few more times, and Erickson was able to correct it each time by adjusting the ballast. The port ballast was empty, but the ship was intent on listing to port. Water had begun to come up on the decks when the list got to 20 degrees. Nobody thought much of it, just a ship bouncing around on the water. By 7:23, The list was so bad and the ship was taking on so much water that the crew instructed all passengers to move to the starboard side. But still, the Eastland was listing badly to port. By 7:27, she was at an angle of 30 degrees with water pouring over the gangplanks. At 7:28, the ship was at 45 degrees and a tragedy was unfolding. The lines holding the Eastland to the dock snapped. People, chairs, luggage, and other items started sliding off the ship and into the river. Captain Peterson sounded an alarm as the ship listed, but never once ordered the ship to be evacuated. Those on the lower decks rushed for the staircase, which unfortunately trapped them as the ship listed and sealed their fate. Panicked passengers slid into the water, slamming on top of each other, desperate to hold on to anything, often dragging others to the bottom. Refrigerators, furniture, pianos, and other equipment toppled down on those in the water, knocking them unconscious or killing them outright. By 7:30 a.m., the Eastland's port side was fully resting on the bottom of the Chicago River, with her opposite side protruding up from the water.
When the ship, turns on its side and it kind of exposes its starboard side, the people who are kind of trapped within it are trying to get out through portholes to the extent that they're possible. But, the diameter of these portholes, it's not that great. And a lot of people simply just can't pass through them. And so as, rescue workers began to arrive, and bear in mind, once again, this is an area of industry and work. It's not that hard to come up with some torches. And so an ad hoc group of individuals, including some people working for the fire department, decide that they're going to start actually trying to break into the hull, right? And rip open holes so they can extract, more people who are trapped within. Peterson is still there. He's kind of just like pacing on the exposed starboard side of the Eastland. And when he sees, these different people with their torches beginning to attempt to breach the hull of the ship, he panics and he tries to stop them. And it's really hard to put yourself in his place and understand why he would behave in this way, particularly when there's believed to be, several hundred, if not 1,000 or more people kind of trapped within the ship, right? Why wouldn't he be doing everything to try to rescue these people? Because, he's one of the first people after the ship kind of turns on its side to get off of it and reach safety, which, if you think about the sort of tradition of the sort of captain going down with his ship, Peterson is not living up to that tradition. He's like, I'm out of here. I mean, he just kind of jumps over the rail and right onto the starboard side. What I'm thinking about is probably what he was in was a state of shock. Now, it's 1915, and the idea of being in a state of shock, is not as well known as it is today. Interestingly enough, the First World War had already broken out by this time. And by the end of that conflict, people would become much more kind of cognizant, right, of the sort of effect that traumatic events could happen or could have on people, both in the immediate moment, but also afterwards as well. Peterson, in his defense, would later say that, as he was kind of leaping to safety, he ended up banging his head on a bit of the boat, and perhaps that's what caused him to behave in that way. But the effect of it is that the rescue workers more or less ignored him. The crowd that was kind of gathering around the site of the tragedy began to kind of direct their ire at him when they saw him behaving in this way. And eventually, the police would take him into custody, and they would also not just take him into custody, but also have to protect him from the growing crowds, which really, particularly when he kind of manifested this behavior as people were attempting to rescue some of the passengers, it really did kind of draw a lot of negative attention toward him. And there were threats of violence against the captain.
Those on the port side had virtually no chance, and hundreds were trapped on the lower decks. Crew members were able to save a fortunate few and pull them from the water, but the full dress of heavy clothes worn for the outing made it difficult for victims to swim in the water, and the extra weight pulled them down. Harlan Babcock from the Chicago Herald wrote, "In an instant, the surface of the river was black with struggling, crying, frightened, drowning humanity. We infants floated about like corks. People on the pier and bridge nearby desperately threw ropes and other items trying to give a lifeline to the people suffering in the water." Helen Ripa, a Western Electric nurse, said, "I shall never be able to forget what I saw. People were struggling in the water, clustered so thickly that they literally covered the surface of the river. A few were swimming. The rest were floundering about, some clinging to a little raft that had floated free, others clutching at anything they could reach. bits of wood at each other, grabbing each other, pulling each other down, and screaming. The screaming was the most horrible of all.
Within seconds of the Eastland rolling on its side and passengers floating in the water or being trapped within the hull, the people who were kind of surrounding the tragedy sprung into action. Immediately to the north of where the Eastland lay was the Reed Murdoch building. It was a business that was basically specialized in wholesale groceries. And there were a lot of employees that were there and kind of observed what was happening. And they began like tossing things into the river, basically like barrels, other bits of wood, crates, and so forth that would float that then the passengers could grab onto. In fact, there were even some employees of that company who just dove into the river and began trying to kind of help extricate some of the victims of the Eastland. On the south side of the river, which is where people disembarked from, and that was where the ship was closest to. Also, you had all of the other people who are planning to be part of this Western Electric excursion, observing this tragedy. So they began to help. And within minutes, you have members of the Chicago Police Department, the Chicago Fire Department on the scene as well. In fact, there was a fire station right there on the river that was just a minute or two away from where the Eastland lay. So you had people who were professional rescuers there. You had people who were, fellow Western Electric employees. You had people who were working at some of these other businesses, and all of them, perhaps not in the most coordinated of ways, respond to this tragedy and begin to help. And that's not to even mention all of the other craft that were on the river at the time. So the Eastland was one of several steamers that were planning to go to Michigan City that day and transport Western Electric workers. And so you had some people from the crew of the Theodore Roosevelt, which was another steamer nearby, lending a hand. You had the tugboat that was going to help the Eastland and kind of lead it out of the Chicago River into Lake Michigan, the Kenosha. The crew there springs into action. And you even had people in smaller craft that just happened to be on the water. And if they could get close to somebody who was flailing or are trying to swim, they could kind of pull them to safety. So really, everyone sort of kind of sprung into action within just moments of the Eastland rolling over.
Some on the top deck on the starboard side were able to climb over the top rail and jump down onto the dock. Doctors on the scene used a machine called a lung motor, which pumped air in and out of the lungs to try to resuscitate victims on the pier. By 8 a.m., all who were able to survive had already been rescued. Countless bodies could be seen in the river, including women, children, and babies. Luggage, children's toys, and personal items bobbed up and down in the water, just memories of life only a few moments ago. The health department immediately set up stations around the city to vaccinate victims for typhoid and other infectious diseases because the river at that time was so heavily polluted with sewage. The number of bodies being pulled from the river was so great that the nearby Reed Murdoch warehouse was used as a temporary morgue. At the 2nd Regiment Armory, over 700 bodies were assembled for identification. Lines stretched for blocks with families waiting to try to find their loved ones.
In the immediate aftermath of the Eastland tragedy, the city of Chicago and the town of Cicero, where Western Electric were located, more or less shut down for a couple of days. It's July in Chicago. There were some baseball games that were scheduled. The Chicago Whales that day were going to honor one of their star players and manager, shortstop Joe Tinker, better remembered for his time with the Chicago Cubs, part of the infamous Tinker to Evers to Chance combination of which would result in many a memorable double play. But William Wiegum, the owner of the Chicago Whales, which was part of the short-lived Federal League, he immediately cancels that game and the plans to honor Tinker. In case you're curious, they played at Weigman Field at the corner of Clark and Addison, today known as Wrigley Field. So the Cubs would, when the Whales folded as a franchise, the Cubs would move in. But the Cubs, or pardon me, the Chicago Whales weren't the only entity to kind of respond to the tragedy and change plans. So movie theaters shut down, cabarets shut down, in the city of Chicago. The mayor at the time, William Hale Thompson, wasn't in town. He was actually in San Francisco on the West Coast at the San Francisco World's Fair, Pan American Exposition. He was getting ready for a special Chicago day that they were going to have there. And he and his entourage, as well as the governor of Illinois, who was also out there, Edward Dunn, they decided all to immediately travel back to Chicago. It's decided that the Wednesday after the tragedy, July 28th, will be basically a citywide day of mourning. So all non-essential city agencies closed down, many businesses closed down, memorial services are held throughout the city. But ultimately, it is that community of Cicero that has the deepest impact. I mean, that's where a majority of the over 800 who lost their lives resided. And a lot of them would end up being interred at a cemetery that's within Chicago, but not that far from Cicero, called Bohemian National Cemetery, where a memorial exists to the victims of the Eastland that one can visit today. But what's interesting is how quickly everyday life sort of reasserts itself after the tragedy. So for the people who lost family members, it's something that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. But the rest of the city very quickly kind of moves forward. And even plans of creating a kind of formal memorial near the site of the accident, like nothing like that really materializes. And, it's worth pointing out, too, even on the day of the tragedy itself, it didn't stop other excursion steamers from going out on Lake Michigan, with the exception of the Eastland and the other ships that were connected specifically to the Western Electric trip. A lot of other boats were still on the lake, and they just kind of carried about their business. And, what it suggests is how quickly this sort of tragedy just gets sort of absorbed into the everyday rhythms of life in the city, and the city just kind of moves past this very kind of traumatic event. And Western Electric moves past this traumatic event. And they continue to be a major employer in the region. And they just sort of like move forward. And it's really just the kind of individual families who then have to kind of deal with this sense of loss. It's as being a kind of collective sense of loss that kind of recedes fairly quickly.
The search for bodies continued for weeks, and a net was stretched across the river to help find bodies that were being carried away in the river's current. Divers were employed to explore the wreck in hopes of finding those who did not make it out of the ship. During search efforts, spectators could often be seen at the site to watch the recovery efforts. They watched as people were pulled onto the wharf on stretchers, one by one. Following the accident, the city now had to deal with the unpleasant task of burying the dead. The number of victims taxed local cemeteries, funeral directors, coroners, gravediggers, and hearses. At St. Mary of Chautauqua Catholic Church, there were 29 coffins at a single funeral, stacked up on pews due to lack of space in the church. Western Electric employee George Sindelar's funeral took place at Mason's Hall, together with his wife Josephine and all 5 of his children. Back in Cicero, where many of the victims lived, houses were decorated with flowers and wreaths. The body of a young boy remained unidentified, and he became somewhat of a mysterious poster child of the disaster. Only labeled as body number 396, notices were distributed asking for information about the boy. 2 young boys from a Cub Scout troop eventually came forward and were able to identify the boy as 7-year-old William Novotny. The boy's father, James, mother Agnes, and sister Mamie all died aboard the Eastland. The Western Electric Company did not leave these families out in the cold. The company voluntarily paid a total of $181,000 to the victims' families. 6 months' pay awarded for those with up to 10 years' service, and a 1 year's pay for longer service. The Red Cross additionally provided $200 for adults, $150 for children, $500 for widows, and children who lost both parents were given $12 a month until age 16. Acting Mayor William R. Morehouse called on prominent Chicago citizens and businesses. The heads of Sears Roebuck and Marshall Field raised $200,000 in 2 days to help the victims' families. The owner of the Chicago White Sox, Charlie Comiskey, along with the Quaker Oats Company and others, raised over $400,000, which is over $11 million in today's money. A young George Halas, the future National Football League co-founder, and owner and head coach of the Chicago Bears, worked at Western Electric at this time, and he was planning on going to the annual event. Fortunately for the iconic American football pioneer, he was delayed and missed the boarding. In total, 841 passengers, 2 crew members, and 1 crew member from another boat all died as a result of this tragedy.
In the aftermath of the Eastland tragedy, several investigations were launched. There was one that was led by the Cook County State Attorney, a gentleman by the name of Maclay Hoyne, but the federal government also gets involved fairly early on. So there's an district attorney, a federal district attorney by the name of Charles Klein, who also launches his own investigation. And then there's even a government inquiry that starts as well. So the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, a gentleman by the name of Redfield, travels from Washington to kind of investigate the tragedy because it's within his department that the federal safety inspectors are situated. And so in some ways, maritime safety kind of falls under his purview. And all 3 of these investigations have very similar targets. They're looking at the owners of the Eastland and trying to ascertain whether or not they were aware of some of the past problems that the ship had, and the ship had passed through the hands of several different owners by this point in time. But how aware were they of that history? And did they take certain risks, particularly in regard to passenger capacity? The investigators are looking at the crew, particularly at the actions of Captain Peterson and the chief engineer of the ship. And then the investigators, and particularly the state's attorney, and to some extent the district attorney, they're also looking at the safety inspectors as well. Secretary of Commerce and Labor, to whom these inspectors report, he's not looking at them as much because he doesn't, of course, want any sort of implication of impropriety occurring under his watch. But they become a sort of third target of the investigation. And the suggestion is made that they kind of willfully allowed for the capacity of the boat to be increased because they were basically being paid off by the ship owners to do so. So those are the kind of 3 main targets: the owners, the crew, and the inspectors. What came to light after the Eastland tragedy is that the Western Electric workers who were there to travel to Michigan City, each of them was expected to pay 75 cents, which was the kind of passage and the fare. But the people who were organizing the excursion on behalf of Western Electric and kind of working with the company that was kind of booking the ships and planning everything, they had an arrangement. And so the organizers of the excursion from Western Electric actually managed to get a rebate. So the more passengers they were able to provide, the more fellow employees they were able to provide, the higher was the rebate that they received. And so when the Cook County State Attorney, Maclay Hoyne, begins to kind of investigate the circumstances that led to the Eastland tragedy, and one thing that he's very interested in early on is the ship's fluctuating capacity. How many people were actually on the boat, and did this contribute to what occurred? He seizes on this thread about the rebates and suggesting that both the people who were kind of booking the ship and kind of planning the trip and the people who were planning the picnic for Western Electric, that they were essentially trying to get as many passengers as possible, even if it exceeded what was considered safe. This was all perfectly legal. They had reached this agreement, but it incentivized, trying to encourage as many people as possible to kind of go on this trip. Clearly, the people who owned the Eastland and the company that was kind of planning the overall trip and coordinating with the other steamers, they wanted to get a lot of people because their profits would go up. But then even the people who were kind of organizing the picnic on behalf of Western Electric, they wanted a lot of participants because they would get some money back. So whether or not it was an evidence of collusion or some kind of graft, it's less that than that it kind of incentivized everybody to try to bring the maximum number of people to the docks on that day.
An official of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company testified at a coroner's inquest a few days after the accident. I didn't know much about the boat except that we got it at a bargain. All I do is sign blank checks. Captain Peterson, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson, Inspector Robert Reed, and several officials of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company were later indicted. Federal judge and the future first commissioner of Major League Baseball, Kennesaw Mountain Landis, issued warrants for their arrests, charging them with conspiracy to operate an unsafe ship. The famed defense attorney Clarence Darrow argued that a submerged piling caused the ship to list. Testimony turned out to be conflicting and confused, and no clear pattern could be determined about the course of events.
At the end of the day, no one is found liable and in connection to the Eastland disaster. There just simply isn't enough evidence. So most of the owners, they're not even in the Chicago area. The boat, was traveling between St. Joseph, Michigan, and Chicago. Pretty much everybody who owns the ship is based in Michigan, and there's never enough evidence to even have them extradited and brought to Chicago. As far as the crew goes, it's determined that they more or less were following proper procedure as this tragedy unfolded. Now, did they all act in the best way that they could in the moment? I mean, that's debatable. It seems like the chief engineer, Erickson, pretty much did everything that he could to prevent the tragedy from being even greater. I mean, potentially the ship's boiler could have exploded, and he helped to kind of mitigate that and prevent that from happening, even though in the immediate aftermath, a lot of people placed blame for him in terms of how the ballast system functioned. But when you look at Captain Peterson, I mean, he's an interesting case because of his response in the immediate aftermath and his attempts to basically dissuade rescue workers from making holes in the hull. I mean, his reputation is scathed, but once again, there's not any criminal charges that can be brought against him. And then finally, there's simply no evidence that any of the safety inspectors intentionally increased the capacity of Great Lakes steamers as a result of some kind of graft, right? That they were basically getting some sort of kickbacks or even getting pressure from their superiors who were in collusion with various shipbuilders associations. So at the end of the day, even though over 800 lives are lost, no one is held culpable. And there were even some who were looking at Western Electric as well and wondering, did the company really kind of push and coerce so many of its employees to go on this excursion? And do they have some blame to bear? But ultimately, company too would be exonerated.
It was determined that the accident was due to a faulty design of the ship, and not the fault of anyone on board at the time.
Purpose for which was built originally, it was designed to be a very fast ship. And it was built also to kind of transport fruit, not people, but its kind of purpose shifted. And some people who kind of investigated the Eastland tragedy and the immediate aftermath before what most historians believe today was the true cause of the accident thought that in some ways a lot of the problems lay with the design, that it was kind of built for one purpose, but then a different purpose was applied to it. And it really just wasn't constructed in such a way that could handle thousands of people safely. Most historians today believe that the reason why the Eastland turned on its side, so it turned over into the river onto its port side, exposing its starboard side in about 20 feet of water in the Chicago River, really is the result of good intentions, but perhaps not good intentions that were fully thought through. So we have to think about where we are in history, right? We're in the summer of 1915. We're about 3 years removed from probably one of the most infamous and memorable of maritime disasters, and that's the sinking of the Titanic. And then one of the reasons why so many people perished in that particular event is because there weren't adequate lifeboats. Well, move forward to 1915, there's a relatively new act of Congress, which basically kind of mandates that boats have to either decrease their passenger capacity or add more lifeboats to accommodate for the passenger capacity that they have. And the owners of the Eastland, not wanting to reduce the capacity, because of course they want to make a profit, they just decide to add more lifeboats. And a lot of historians today believe that that is actually what led to the Eastland capsizing, that it was basically top heavy. And so when you add all those thousands of people, you add all those lifeboats, it was almost inevitable that the boat would capsize and turn over. What's interesting, though, is even within a day of the tragedy, you see some people starting to suggest this in newspapers. And even though this cause will later get obscured somewhat in the investigations to follow, there were people who were already kind of thinking about it. In fact, there was one person who owned a shipping company out of Detroit, and he's quoted in the Chicago Tribune talking about how it was actually this act of government, in his opinion, that led to the tragedy. But had there not been more lifeboats added, the Eastland probably would have been able to kind of take that trip and had been just fine.
A civil suit later found Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson responsible, but Eriksson died while the case dragged on for years. Maritime law limited the payout to the value of only the Eastland's hull, valued at $46,000. The law also stipulated that creditors must be paid first, and the company that salvaged the Eastland was owed $35,000. The coal company, concession company, and other creditors were also paid, leaving almost nothing for the families of the dead. The St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company went out of business shortly after. Nobody was ever charged or served any prison time or paid any fines as a result of this accident. The Eastland laid in the Chicago River like a beached whale between Clark and LaSalle streets. The wreck was far too close to the wharf, and salvage ships could not get close enough. Eventually, the hull was repaired enough, and with a complex series of pulleys, ropes, and tugboats, she was able to right herself and be pulled out of the river. The Eastland underwent extensive repairs, but never sailed again as a passenger ship. In 1920, she served as a training ship for the Illinois Naval Reserve under the new name, the Wilmette. In 1946, the Wilmette was sold for scrap and was slowly and eerily towed up the Chicago River past the site of the disaster. Chief Engineer Joseph Eriksson later served in World War I as an engineer and died in 1919 of a heart condition. Harbor Inspector Robert Reed, who approved the Eastland's increased capacity to 2,500, died in 1922. Captain Peterson retired to a farm and never commanded another ship. He died in 1939. After the Eastland disaster, stability tests became mandatory, which determined how many passengers a ship could carry. The Eastland capsized in just 20 feet of water, with its bow only 19 feet from the wharf.
So this is from the Chicago Tribune of July 25th, 1915. In the dire catastrophe of the Eastland, there was no thrilling mid-ocean fight against raging winds and mountain seas, no hidden iceberg on a lonely course, no crash of midnight collision, no thunder of big guns in a clash of rival fleets. But literally, in the heart of a great city, with elevated trains and streetcars thundering past within a few hundred feet, on a mild summer morning, with a multitude to look on in mute helplessness, with metropolitan skyscrapers casting their shadow over it all, something like 1,200 persons went to their death. Today we know, around 800, in a prosaic excursion boat as it capsized at its berth. Small boats were all about, a city fire station within a few dozen steps, and the boat was lashed to its dock. Such was the unparalleled, paradoxical tragedy of the Eastland. The victims perished within reaching distance of shore, within speaking distance of streets crowded with office-bound loop workers. So what I find interesting about that quote is this sort of sense that there's almost a way in which you can't wrap your head around the tragedy of the Eastland. It's unlike other sorts of shipwrecks. It's not like the Titanic, where there's this dramatic moment where it hits an iceberg. It's not the result of a naval battle. It happens right in the heart of a city, and in such an unexpected and quick way, and with help so close at hand, that it's almost as if people can't rationalize it or make sense of it. And in some ways, it's easier just to try to forget about it and just go about your everyday life and in the aftermath of it.
In total, 844 people lost their lives. The dead included 22 families completely wiped out, 228 teenagers, 58 infants and young children. 70% of the victims were under the age of 25, and the average age of those killed was 23.
Today, there are a couple different memorials to the Eastland disaster. On the south side of the Chicago River, there's a plaque that sort of describes the event. It's very close to where the Eastland rolled over. If you go to the north side of the river, the Reed Murdoch building still stands. It's not the home of Reed Murdoch anymore. It's the Whirlpool building. But on the first floor, you can go in there and you can see a memorial to the Eastland disaster and to the victims, and several photographs and a kind of list of names of those who died. Bohemian National Cemetery is where one can go and see the graves of many of the people who perished on the Eastland. But there are other bits and pieces of the boat's story that you can find across the city. At the Chicago History Museum, where I work, we have an extensive collection of artifacts from the Eastland, but also photographs as well. One of the first people to arrive on the scene was a Chicago Daily News photographer by the name of Jun Fujita. And Jun Fujita was an immigrant from Japan. He was a poet as well as a photographer. And he is an interesting figure in that he, simply because of his profession, ended up being present at some of the key moments in the city's history. So he is the person who produces most of the images that people who are aware of the Eastland story have seen. If you were to go to a sister institution of the Chicago History Museum here in Chicago, the Newberry Library, that's where you can find the employee records of the Western Electric Company. And in fact, you can find a ledger that more or less lists every single person employed there who perished on the Eastland and how much they received from the company in compensation. And alongside a lot of these entries are pictures of the employees. So that's a very tragic document. And then in a neighborhood where I once lived in the city called Pilsen, which is a little bit south and west of Chicago's Loop, for those of you who know the city's geography. There used to be a historic Czech neighborhood. On an old railroad viaduct, there's a mural dedicated to the victims of the Eastland. And it's just this very kind of haunting painting of these men, women, and children in 19-teens attire getting ready to board the ship going up the gangway. And it's faded a little bit now in time, and it's just sort of haunting. They're all kind of painted to scale, and it's almost as if they sort of have stepped out of the past and are kind of looking at us today.
That brings us to the conclusion of the SS Eastland episode. Thank you so much to Paul Durica for joining me for this episode. Paul is the Director of Exhibitions at the Chicago History Museum and the creator of The Pocket Guide to Hell, a series of free, interactive talks, walks, and reenactments focused on Chicago history. You can find more about his work at pocketguidetohell.com, and you can also listen to the Pocket Guide to Hell podcast series on Spotify. You can find links, photos, and sources related to this episode at shipwrecksandseadogs.com. You can also follow Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at ShipwrecksPod. Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs is written, edited, and produced by me, Rich Napolitano, your host. Original theme music is by Sean Siegfried, and you can find him on YouTube at Sean Secret. I hope you've been enjoying the episodes thus far. I am going to take a little bit of a break for the December holidays, and I will return in January with a new episode. Until then, everybody be safe out there, enjoy your holidays, and see you next time.